Good day everyone! For today's video, I will discuss to you the cellular respiration on how food that we are eating convert into a form of energy in order for us to do extreme activities. So let's begin. We need to know first what is cellular respiration. So cellular respiration class is a process by which mitochondria break down food molecules to produce ATP or adenosine triphosphate that is in a form of energy in plants and even animals. So we include also ourselves here because we are also an example of living organisms. On the picture on the upper right side, you can see that there is an animal cell. That animal cell consists of different organelles. In the mitochondria, it is the site now of the cellular respiration. That is a sausage-like structure organelle. Below, you can see the equation of cellular respiration. So we have the nutrients that is in a form of glucose that we are eating or any food that we are eating plus the oxygen because we are living organism. Of course, in order for us to survive, we need oxygen. Even plants and animals needs also oxygen to survive. So that nutrients plus the oxygen now are the reactants or the raw materials needed by our cells. And on the other side, we have the water. And after obtaining oxygen, we are releasing water in a form of urine, in a form of our sweat. Plus ATP. Of course, when we eat food, we have the so-called energy. And that is the adenosine triphosphate. We have also carbon dioxide. We are releasing toxins in our body in a form of fart and even when we are exhaling. So these are now the byproducts of cellular respiration. Just take note guys, in cellular respiration, it is the change of organic energy and that is in a form of glucose into inorganic energy and that is the ATP. So we are eating to have energy to do all the activities, even extreme activities we are doing every day. Here is a photosynthesis chemical equation. So let's just have a review about the chemical equation of photosynthesis. Isn't it? Plants needs light energy, water, and even carbon dioxide to produce glucose and oxygen. Take note, light energy, water, and carbon dioxide are the reactants or the raw materials needed by the plants. And on the other side, we have the glucose plus oxygen that is now the byproducts. Now, let's see the chemical equation of cellular respiration. Observe that the reactants of cellular respiration are glucose and oxygen. And on the other side, the byproducts of cellular respiration are water, carbon dioxide, and ATP in a form of energy. The photosynthesis chemical equation below. So the reactants of photosynthesis are light energy, water, and carbon dioxide. And the byproducts are glucose and oxygen. The reactants of the cellular respiration are the byproducts of photosynthesis. Again, we have the glucose and the oxygen because this is the raw materials needed by our body in order for us to survive. We need glucose and oxygen. And we obtain this glucose from plants because it produces its own food and that is the glucose and even the oxygen releases in the atmosphere. And the byproducts now are the reactants of photosynthesis. That is the water, the carbon dioxide. So on this cellular respiration chemical equation and even the photosynthesis chemical equation, it shows give and take relationship. The plants now produces glucose and oxygen wherein we can consume that one in order for us to live because as we eat, we need this glucose. And as a byproducts, we are giving now to the plants in order for them to survive. So that is a give and take relationship between living organisms such as animals and human beings. Plants are producers and we human beings and animals are the consumers. Cellular respiration has 3 stages. We have the glycolysis, the citric acid or the so-called the Krebs cycle, and we have the electron transport change. Glycolysis perform anaerobic respiration. anaerobic does not require oxygen. So it means that it doesn't need oxygen to perform this cycle. And this glycolysis is happening in our cytoplasm. The citric acid or the Krebs cycle now is aerobic, wherein it requires oxygen to perform this respiration in our cell. Now, the citric acid or Krebs cycle respiration is happening in the mitochondria. And the electron transport chain also needs oxygen, and that is aerobic respiration. This electron transport chain is happening in our mitochondria, one of the organelles in our cell. This is happening in our cytoplasm, wherein this is anaerobic. It does not require oxygen. Glycolysis now breaks down glucose into two molecules of pyruvic acid. So this is now the byproduct of glycolysis. This pyruvic acid is a colorless acid formed as an important intermediate in metabolism or fermentation. At the latter part of our discussion, we will also talk about the fermentation, and glycolysis is one of the cycle happening on this fermentation. This reaction uses enzymes and takes place in the cytoplasm of our cell. That is why this is so-called anaerobic respiration or anaerobic reaction, because it does not require oxygen. Take note of the byproduct. It is the pyruvic acid. So it produces now in glycolysis the two pyruvic acid molecules used in the next step of cellular respiration. So before we can proceed to the Krebs cycle or the next step of cellular respiration, it needs two pyruvic acid molecules. And during the glycolysis, it produces now two ATP molecules. That is the energy the cell can use. Take note, it produces 2 ATP adenosine triphosphate, and that is an energy. And it produces also 2 NADH or 2 nicotinamide adenine diphosphate with hydrogen. That is an electron carrier. So all in all, we have 2 pyruvic acid, 2 ATP, and 2 NADH in the process of glycolysis. That is the first cycle. Now, let's proceed to the mitochondria. Take note that the pyruvic acid produces on the cytoplasm will now enter to the mitochondria. So before the next step of cellular respiration can occur, the pyruvic acid molecules now will enter this sausage-like structure, and that is the mitochondria. The two oxygen-dependent or aerobic reactions are the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. As I've said a while back, in the glycolysis process, it does not need oxygen. Therefore, that is anaerobic respiration. But now, since the pyruvic acid will enter now the mitochondria, it is now anaerobic reactions or even in the electron transport chain. That is also anaerobic respiration. Take note that citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle is happening in the mitochondria. So the pyruvic acid now, the two molecules of pyruvic acid will converted into that two molecules of acid will now release carbon dioxide, water, and also energy in a form of ATP. And on this citric acid or Krebs cycle, the two pyruvic molecules will now used by the citric acid cycle. So the yield or it produces now 1 ATP, 3 NADH, and 1 FADH2. What is that 1 ATP? That is adenosine triphosphate. That is 1 molecule of energy. And we have 3 NADH, nicotinamide adenine diphosphate with hydrogen. And we have also 1 FADH2, that is the flavine adenine dihydrogen. So with this, we have all in all, we need to times 2 this 1 ATP. We need to times 2 the NADH and even the FADH2, because there is 2 molecules of pyruvic. We have 2 cycle happening. So we need to multiply it by 2. All in all, it produces 2 ATP, 6 NADH, and we have 2 FADH2. Take note that we have 2 ATP produces in the glycolysis, and on the second cycle, reproduces another 2 ATP. Pyruvate from glycolysis fuels the cycle now under Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. Carbon dioxide is released. The carbon dioxide again is released from the second, and ATP now is being released. So that is the byproduct. NADH and FADH2 is released. The third cycle, we have the electron transport chain, wherein the electron transport chain uses the electron carriers. So this is happening still on the mitochondria matrix. So from that membrane of the mitochondria, it is now happening the electron transport chain. So the carriers now, the NADH and FADH2 that produces by the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle to pass electrons down the protein chain and slowly release this energy that is used to form ATP and water molecules. This is now the summary of the 3 cycles happening in our cell. So first one, we have the glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and we have the electron transport chain. So imagine that we eat food, and that is in a form of glucose. It will now enter our cell. So first, it will swim into our cytoplasm, the liquid structure in our cell, and the glycolysis is happening now in our cytoplasm. Take note that this is anaerobic because it does not require oxygen. It produces now ATP, that is an energy. We have 2 energy and pyruvic acid, 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. Right after producing pyruvic acid, this acid now will enter the mitochondria, wherein citric acid cycle is happening. It releases carbon dioxide, NADH, and FADH, and produces ATP, an energy as well. We have 2 ATP because in every pyruvic acid, it will split into 2. Therefore, 2 cycle is happening inside the mitochondria. Now, the NADH and FADH molecules that was produced in the citric acid cycle will now use in electron transport chain. Of course, it needs oxygen because this is aerobic respiration. This electron transport chain is the last cycle in cellular respiration. Now, the byproducts would be water and ATP, an energy. So at that point, the electron transport chain will produce now plus the 2 ATP produces in the citric acid cycle plus the 2 ATP produced all in all in the electron transport chain, which is the last stage of the cycle of cellular respiration, produced 36 ATP. So we need to add now the 2 ATP produced in the citric acid cycle. Because in the glycolysis, ATP produced is used during the citric acid cycle. So we have only 36 ATP molecules in every 6 molecules of glucose. Let's see the cellular respiration equation. Now take a look on the summary of cellular respiration equation with the 3 cycles happening in our cell, most particularly the cytoplasm and in mitochondria. So take note, we have here the glucose as our reactants and oxygen. So glucose made in photosynthesis by plants or consumed by animals. So this is now used in the glycolysis. Oxygen from the atmosphere used in electron transport chain. The carbon dioxide or the waste product of the citric acid cycle and water released from the electron transport chain now obtaining or produced ATP released from glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain. So, the sum up of this cellular respiration equation, it produces between 34 to 36 ATP made with this 3 process. This ATP can be used by the cells for cellular metabolism. In order for us to do our activities every day, we need this glucose. And these 3 processes is included in our cell to convert the food that we eat from the energy that we can use every day. Let's talk about the fermentation. So this is related now in our discussion about cellular respiration because of the anaerobic and anaerobic respiration. When oxygen is not available, anaerobic respiration or the so-called the fermentation can follow also the glycolysis, the first cycle in the cellular respiration, in order to continue to produce energy. So we have two types of fermentation. We have the lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation. The alcohol fermentation, we can see here the tapoy or the rice wine, and there is also a relationship between the yeast that makes the bread rise. So yeast and some bacteria cells are capable of alcoholic fermentation, during which glucose is broken down to release carbon dioxide and produces ethyl alcohol or the beverages that we are drinking. We have the glucose, and during the process of glycolysis, it produces pyruvic acid, and the byproducts now are alcohol, carbon dioxide, and ATP. In alcoholic fermentation, the bubbles now formed by the carbon dioxide can make the bread rise. That is in a form of yeast. And the alcohol now released turns grape juice into wine. So this is the process of fermentation. It uses the cycle glycolysis or anaerobic respiration because it does not need oxygen for this fermentation. In lactic acid fermentation, this is the reason why we experience cramps when we are doing exercise or extreme activities. Lactic acid fermentation occurs in muscle cells during extraneous exercise when a lot of energy is required and oxygen is scarce. So we have the glucose, the pyruvic acid, and lactic acid as the byproducts, and even ATP as well. So lactic acid fermentation is transferred from the muscle cells and even to our liver, where it will be converted back into pyruvic acid. The lactic acid fermentation or the build-up of lactic acid in the muscles is what causes them to be fatigued and sore. Muscle cramps will usually occur because of these activities. So as you can see on the picture, these are the different parts of our body or our muscles that usually